Hello, everybody. Welcome to Pensive Politics with Mr. Watson. I am your host, Christian Watson. And with me today, I have someone who I have admired for a very, very long time, Dr. Sebastian Gorka, who was the National Security Advisor for President Trump in 2017, and also is a political commentator and in his own right. I think he's a force of nature. Dr. Gorka, thank you so much for being here. I'm still stunned and astonished that you're here, but I'm very happy, gratefully so.
Well, you performed very well on my national radio show when you came on a couple of weeks ago, and then afterwards you were rather insistent that I come on your podcast, so I'm happy to do so. Little correction, General Flynn was the National Security Advisor. I was Deputy President for Strategy, but
yes.
These are rather confusing.
Yes, indeed. Well, speaking of that same genre, I've throughout the Trump administration, I heard you articulate very eloquently the vision for what is called America First. And that term has been thrown around a lot throughout decades of American, political history, whether it be in the 1920s when that term was invoked to, some would argue, signify a kind of isolation from the world, or right now where that term is now invoked to signify, as you would say, as you said it in an interview you gave with Dave Rubin, not being isolationist or interventionist, but instead being a ideology that prioritizes America's interests. My question for you is, upon what foundation, as a matter of first principles, is the idea of America First built upon? And I suppose before we answer that question, we could also ask, to you, what does America First mean holistically? Besides being a midway between interventionism and isolationism, what does it mean for you holistically?
Right. So let me answer that. It's a fabulous question. Let me answer that in two ways. I'll tell you what it means for me as a legal immigrant to the United States who chose this country, who believes it is the greatest nation on God's green earth. And then I'll talk to you about what it meant to President Trump, who used the phrase America First to become elected in a way that people forget. And I find it amusing. I have to remind my fellow Americans of this fact. President Trump did something historically stunning in 2016, and people missed this. From George Washington to Obama, every president we've ever had in the Republic is, to use a derisive phrase, a member of the swamp. Every single president was either a retired general, a senator, a congressman, or a former governor. For the first time in 2016, the American people did something really stunning. They voted for somebody who'd never been involved in politics, never led our armies, was a private citizen, and was a businessman. So something very significant happened in 2016, I think, because of the way that President Trump articulated this concept of America First. Now, you're correct. The two words have antecedents, but what President Trump represents isn't a Buchananite isolationism of the 1970s or 80s, is not a 1930s isolationism either. It's something different, and it comes from the following. So for me, the answer is there is a massive scale of options America can choose for its role in the world. You have on the two extremes, you have apologizing for America, like the Obama administration did. First thing Obama did was to go on a literal global apology tour where you say America is the problem. Then you have the neo-conservative that says democracy is great and we're going to force it down the throats of other nations at the end of a gun barrel, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, or elsewhere. These are stupid. These are un-American. One is truly, truly anti-American. The other is naive and extreme and anti-democratic. What I believe is that America has a special role to play, not as an interventionist country, but as a country that represents the best of Western civilization. And when we are strong, the world is safe. Just look at the 4 years of our time in the White House. We didn't invade anywhere, but we didn't say that the world doesn't matter. We didn't say, forget about everywhere else. And I can't go into detail, but when we saw the intelligence of a repeated use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime in Syria, President Trump, over chocolate cake in Mar-a-Lago, as he was having a state dinner with Xi Jinping of China, said, "Oh, by the way, I just dropped 52 cruise missiles on Assad's Air Force Base because I don't care who you are, you don't get to use chemical weapons against women and children." We didn't invade Syria. We didn't say we're going to turn Syria into a democracy. No, we said, hey, listen, chemical weapons, no, I don't care who you are. And that was a message not just for Assad or Xi Jinping, that was a message for Putin, that was a message for Kim. And when we were strong, the world was safe. Under Obama, we had the rise of ISIS, the invasion of Crimea, North Korea launching ballistic missiles over the Sea of Japan, Iran in a proxy war across the region, on and on and on. So for me, it's America is the greatest nation. When it's strong, the world is safe, but we don't have to intervene everywhere. For President Trump, who's not a national security guy, hasn't lived in the swamp, and he hired me originally when he was plain old Mr. Trump in 2015 to advise him during the GOP debates. For him, there's no sophisticated ideology. There's no taxonomy. You can't plop him into a neoliberal, neoconservative, paleo-con basket. He's not an ideological man. He is an American who loves America, who's been a very successful politician. Now, if you go back in time, if you go back to his interviews with Oprah in the 80s, if you go back to his interviews with Charlie Rose, you'll see a man who may not be a politician, but he has a problem with politics in America. And what he saw is really what's written down in J.D. Vance's autobiography, Hillbilly Elegy. When I was in the White, I don't read nonfiction biographies. I don't have the patience or the time. The only thing I'm interested in is geostrategy and national security, and a little bit of fun, light reading now and again. Autobiographies can. Steve Bannon said to me, my boss in the White House said, "You need to read this book because it explains how America chose a non-politician in 2016. It was a Thanksgiving weekend. I read the whole thing in 2 days. Your viewers need to read it." JD, former Marine, mother was a drug addict, came from a family out of a Tennessee hillbilly family, hard scrabble life. In the book, he explains that in the last 50 years, what has happened in America is this tragedy that what Steve calls the uniparty, meaning Republicans and Democrats together, have basically said, yeah, my constituents elected me, but I'm in the White House now. I'm in the Senate. I'm in the Congress. Screw them. I get to do what I want, which means outsourcing jobs to China, which means saying that we're going to buy steel from Asia, basically selling the middle and working class, people like J.D. Vance's family, down the river. I think the word betrayal is not too strong. It is the betrayal of the American heartland, not based on race, based on American interests. And the man who's been building in construction for 50 years comes along and says, you know what? Why is this happening? America is a force for good. America is the freest nation on God's green earth. It's good to build things. It's good to make things. We've got to start having the political elite not represent themselves, but represent America. So President Trump's America First is security and prosperity. It's really that simple. The mind-blowing thing that the left, and especially the mainstream media, will never understand. And I saw this. I was in the Oval Office with the president. He only wanted two things for all Americans: for you and your family to be safe. That's why we've got to seal the border. That's why we've got to have a strong national defense. And for you to prosper. That's why we get government out of the way. We deregulate. We unleash the energy sector. We cut taxes. And the shocking thing is, my friend, he wanted you to be safe and your family to be safe and prosper, whether or not you voted for him. Right. If you're an American in America, he wants you to thrive and to be safe. And that's what America First meant for President Trump, and what it still means for him.
It's fascinating. Yeah. And there's a lot in your response. There's so many avenues we could go down. But I wanted to touch on the point about Syria, which I think reflects a general principle of President Trump being perhaps the closest thing that America has had to a peacetime president in the past few decades. I think I would dare say since Jimmy Carter, from what I, yeah, since Jimmy Carter, because I think under every other president, preceding President Trump, going all the way back to Jimmy Carter, America was in some kind and started in some kind of conflict, whether it was with Reagan and the Contras or the various activities the Americans were doing around the world to counter Soviet influence, whether it be with Bush going into Kuwait, Bush Sr. going into Kuwait. I know Clinton did some things as well. I can't necessarily recollect what he did. I haven't really studied, but I know he did some things as well. And then of course Bush Jr. going.
He bombed Sudan.
What's that?
Clinton bombed Sudan.
Yes. And then Bush Jr. going in, after 9/11, creating the DHS and bolstering the intelligence apparatus, and then going into Iraq and Afghanistan, respectively. We don't see that kind of behavior under President Trump. And I think that for many Americans, it was quite inspiring. In fact, we saw a kind of behavior, a kind of prudence that can only occur during peacetime. And what I mean, and I'll give you a quick example. President Trump's admonition that NATO should pay up their fair share, that America cannot be the person who is defending European nations while they squander their money on social welfare programs and don't put any money towards the defense budget. That's brilliant, because NATO is meant to be a mutually beneficial defensive pact. Now, I have personal issues with NATO. I think that NATO's foundations are built upon principles, universal ideas, such as democracy and so on, that they cannot affirm given the fact that NATO is so involved in, they're so subject to the whims of international bureaucrats. I've always seen NATO as the sort of enforcement arm of the UN. A good example of this is when UN Resolution 1973 happened to go in to authorize a no-fly zone over Libya. And immediately NATO jumped into action, sprung forth. America took the lead, obviously, but I've always seen NATO as a sort of enforcement arm for the UN. And I think that it's very hard to aspire to universal principles and to fulfill your core functions if you're always chasing every dog you see down the road, if you're always being distracted by the geopolitics surrounding you. And President Trump, with the prudence of a peacetime president, said, this is not acceptable. We cannot have this. This goes against America's interest. This doesn't even help you because we're footing the bill for you. You've got to step up. And I remember pundits at that time saying, President Trump is threatening the global international order. Well, perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the point is that the global international order was mediocre and needed a little bit of pushing. I don't want to go on for too long. What do you think about all of that? Do you think that's a good assessment?
I'm not sure I agree with it in totality, but I'm very impressed with your thoughtfulness. So, I mean, this could be a discussion for hours because I started my national security career. So I served in the British Reserve Army. I was in an intelligence UK. So I served in a NATO army. Then after the fall of communism, I helped Hungary, the newly liberated Hungary. I served in the first freely elected conservative administration in Budapest, working in the defense ministry, working expressly on trying to get Hungary, a free nation, into NATO, which we achieved in 1999. So I cut my national security teeth. I got my chops on NATO issues in the 1990s. So, a couple of things about NATO. NATO number one was a bluff, okay? As a British air commodore once told me, if World War III had ever occurred, if the Soviets had ever, decided to invade Western Europe, NATO forces, all of them, including the Brits, would have been a speed bump for the Second Red Army. The only thing that would have stopped the Soviets is us nuking Moscow. And that's, the Article 5 collective defense guarantee. So we paid, America secured Europe for 40 years, which meant they didn't really have to take their defense seriously, and they could become social markets. They could become welfare states because they knew they didn't have to choose between guns and butter. We provided the guns, they could choose the butter. However, historically, it is the most successful modern military alliance. Why? Because that Article 5 that we paid for meant that we didn't have nuclear war from April 1949 until the Soviet Union collapsed on Christmas Day 1991. Then, and I think this is where your criticism of being an arm of the UN comes in the 1990s, it has a crisis of identity. There was a US senator who said, and it became a real catchphrase amongst wonks, that NATO has to go, quote, out of area or out of business, which is really weird. Your job is to protect the territory of the 16 or then 19 nations, and then American senators are saying, well, you got to bomb other parts of the world. You've got to get involved militarily in Serbia or Libya or elsewhere to show that you have a raison d'etre, to show that you have a purpose. That's not why it was founded. To quote Lord Ismay, one of the first Secretary Generals of NATO, very cynical statement, NATO was created to do three things: to keep Germany down after World War II, to keep Russia out of Europe, and to keep America in Europe, which is really, it's cynical, but it's a fact. We weren't created to bomb, to fight Serbian jet fighters in a civil war in 1995 over the territory of former Yugoslavia. So, but to your broader point, the president was very clear. And I was working these issues in the 90s. NATO was crippled by something called the freeloader complex, which meant we paid for basically everything. Two nations had quasi-serious capabilities because of their imperial history. That was the UK, that had expeditionary capabilities, not huge, but they demonstrated them in the Falklands, and France because of Côte d'Ivoire and its territories in Africa. Everybody else was a joke, and even big nations like France, like Germany, would not keep to their agreements to spend 2% of their GDP on their own defense, so that we didn't have to protect them all. And President Trump said, hang on, I'm a member of a club. I don't care whether it's a chess club or the local racquetball club. And we have 10 members, but I'm paying the dues for 6 of them. Are you kidding? That's not a club. That's a group of moochers. So he said, pay up. And I remember when Merkel came to DC for the first visit with President Trump, and the chancellor's walking around trying to say, well, I'm a real statesman, you're just an amateur, you're not a politician. And her team tries to lecture us on, what do you mean that we're not serious about defense? We are very serious about defense in Germany. And Steve pulls out a piece of paper and says, the commander-in-chief just signed this. This is the latest defense budget. And the increase in the Pentagon's defense budget that we just signed, just the increase is bigger than the German defense budget. You're not serious. You're amateurs. You are not allies. So this is what the president meant. Number one, if you want to be our friend, bloody well act like it. Be serious. Pay your dues. And then the flip side of that, which is really one of the reasons he got elected, is, to use his terminology, stop the stupid wars. Stop the dumb wars. He may not know the difference between Mahan and Spikeman. He may not have read Thucydides, but guess what? He knows that going to Afghanistan, a nation of 36 languages that's never functioned as a federal state in world history, and trying to say, we will turn that into the Switzerland of Central Asia, you're smoking crack if you believe that. You're going into Iraq and saying, yeah, we're going to turn Iraq into a functioning nation, and the Baathists are just going to agree with us, and Al-Qaeda will be fine with it. You are on drugs. So he brought that common sense clarity to national security, which, look, I could talk about this for hours.
Yes,
I've worked in the Beltway. I've been a security analyst for the Rand Corporation in the 90s. My company with my wife had the only external counterterrorism training contract for the FBI. I've worked with Fort Bragg and the Green Berets for over a decade. Creative thinking, qualitative creative thinking from the gads of think tanks in this city is non-existent. It's garbage. It is a group think, mutual masturbation society. And if you have a good idea, you will be fired or you will be buried in busy work. I've seen it. Everything's got to be safe. You can't counter the conventional wisdom because you're a threat to the vested interests of wherever it is, Raytheon, Rand, or what have you. And you know what the joy was of working for one of the many joys of working for President Trump is he had no sacred cows because he never worked in Washington, and specifically, and this is why they had to destroy him, because nobody owns President Trump. Okay, he's a self-made man. Big Pharma doesn't own him. Oil doesn't own him. The unions don't own him. The RNC definitely doesn't own him. The DNC doesn't own him. So he is not beholden to establishment ways of doing business. And one of the most dangerous things, Christian, that you could do with my old boss is when you went, and I saw him do this with, 3-star, 4-star generals. They'd be talking about an issue like, the defense of an Asian nation that we pay for or whatever. And President Trump would say, why do we do that this way? And the general would kind of go, because that's how we've been doing it for 40 years. I mean, you would get screamed at or marched out of the Oval Office, because just because we've been doing it like that for 40 years is probably the worst answer, because guess what? That's not an explanation or a justification, and the American people are probably getting screwed because we've been doing it like that for 40 years. So in comes a guy who says, sorry, how much is Germany paying to NATO? Sorry, how much are we paying to defend South Korea? Why don't they pay for it? What, they're not poor. So this is the reality of the swamp, that it's safe, it's conventional, it doesn't represent the American people, and along comes a guy who just loves America. I mean, this is the madness, if you will, of 2016, that a billionaire who lives in Manhattan connected more with the average manual worker in America than anybody in the city, and anybody from the Democrat Party who says, hey, we represent the small guy, we represent the working class. Bollocks, you do. A man who actually worked in construction as a 17-year-old for his dad in Queens. He understands the working class, not the DNC that is now a bi-coastal elites party.
Yeah, no, I think President Trump represented a much needed iconoclasm in the DC establishment, because, a lot of people, Dr. Gorka, and this is something that I've learned, just being a novice student of philosophy and analyzing how people interact with ideas. A lot of people put themselves in what I call epistemic change, in that they do not reevaluate or question their preconceptions, their deeply held ideas. And that habit becomes even more dangerous when those deeply held ideas are paired with institutional force. Because not only now are these ideas resting within you, the stakes are higher because they are now a part of the DNA of an institution. And that institution affects many people, in this case, how the military conducts itself, how the Pentagon conducts itself. And so there's this sort of link between, mediocre thinking and even more mediocre action. And I think that expresses itself in government policy. And President Trump simply said, hey, no, we have to check this. We have to look at the foundations of this to see if this makes any sense whatsoever. And I appreciate that. I think every great man throughout history had that iconoclastic quality to him, yes. Whether it be Socrates, whether it be Jesus, whether it be Galileo, regardless of who it is. And that's something that we're missing from our politicians, most certainly. And this is one of the reasons. Oh, sorry. Go on.
It's not just politicians. It's anyone. It's human beings. I mean, one of the most, look, I learned this. I'm an only child. My parents were persecuted in a dictatorship, first under Nazi occupation as children, and then my father was betrayed by Kim Philby, arrested and tortured by the secret police of the communist regime, and given a life sentence at the age of 20. So, I have a certain way of looking at the world that comes from a family that's suffered true political persecution. I'm also an only child, which provides a certain prism. And then once I became an effective spokesman for the president, especially when it came to the travel ban in the first week of the administration, when I became a face of explaining that, my family and I came under withering attack. I mean, and I'm fine. I'm attacked. I get it. I mean, one journalist wrote 52 hit pieces on me in 5 months, but then they came after my wife, and then they attacked my high school age son in an article. So at that point, yes, it's tough, but it's also liberating, because one of the greatest things a man can ever achieve is being at a point in his life where the adulation and the approval of others is irrelevant. The only people you need to please, or the only people you should seek the approval of, are your loved ones and God. And far too many people censor themselves or tailor their behavior or limit what they say because they're afraid of how others will react. When you arrive at a point in your life where you realize those are the chains, we don't live in slavery, but for the oppression that we allow ourselves to fall under when it comes to temptation, and the chains that we build for ourselves, the chains that we tie ourselves down with by wanting the approval of others. And it's so pernicious, it's so poisonous. Let me talk about, what I saw in the White House. I mean, I was there as an immigrant. The first day I walked in, it was Saturday after the inauguration. Every time I tell this story, it still gives me goosebumps. Everybody else is hungover from the inauguration ball. I don't drink. I haven't had a drop since my parents died. So it may be Saturday morning, but I said, hey, I'm on the clock. I'm deputy to the president. I'm going to work. So I went in an unmarked van driven by a black staff sergeant from the Army. They took us to the executive office building. I got my badge, filled in my HR paperwork. And then I think about this, Kristen. It's giving me chills right now. I walk into the West Wing and there's nobody there except the Secret Service. Everything's empty. I've picked out my office already. And I'm walking around this building and I say to myself, 5 years ago, I wasn't even a freaking citizen. I was naturalized in 2012. And this is the only country in the world where I am walking around the president's office the day after he's been sworn in as president. It's mind-blowing, okay? It is truly, truly, truly mind-blowing. So beyond that, I don't, I've achieved my pinnacle, okay? When it comes to a career, I mean, what are you going to do after that? Okay, I'm not an artist. I'm not going to paint the Mona Lisa. I'm done. I can retire now at the age of, what was that, 46. And then the attacks come, and then you realize that there are people in this building. This is what blew my mind. So it's very weird and archaic and Byzantine.
Oh, please.
I had a rank of DAP. Deputy Assistant to the President. I had no idea what that meant in government terminology because I'd worked with the military and law enforcement. I wasn't familiar with civilian rankings. There's 43 DAPs in the US government. We outrank 3-star generals. I had no idea. The only time I realized that was when I went to the Defense Intelligence Agency for a briefing from the White House, and I arrive in the compound, and it's like, there's red carpet everywhere. Here's the VIP parking spot. Dr. Gorka, can we escort you into the... I said, what? I mean, I realized I outranked basically everybody on the compound except the director of the DIA. So I am what is termed a politically commissioned officer of the president at the rank of deputy to the assistant to the president. Christian, I had guys, I found out, in the stinking building in the White House who had the same rank that I did, politically commissioned, with a big, vellum commissioning document signed by the president, and they hated him. They utterly detested the president. And I'm thinking, dude, you weren't conscripted. You weren't, made drunk and then arrested and given the president's shilling and then, drafted into the White House. You volunteered to be one of 42 people at one of the highest ranks in the federal government. And you hate the person you're working for? And then I saw these people wanting the approval of the establishment. I saw people saying, getting crushed that the Washington Post wasn't writing something nice about them. And I say, hang on a second, the Washington Post hates your boss and hates the 64 million people that voted for him. So why the hell are you even talking to them? I was treated as a pariah. I told everybody in the press office, I told Sean, I told everybody, I don't want to talk on the record. I don't want to talk off the record. I don't want to talk on background to any of these scum. They're like 3 journalists I trust who aren't wankers, and I'll talk to them. But everybody else,
Dr. Gorka.
we are deplorable. Well, guess what? I don't need the approval of people who think I represent Nazis and think half the nation are fascists. So, this is, we're going down rabbit holes here, but this is, how I got to a place where I don't give a crap anymore. If my metric is, am I serving God?
Yeah.
And am I being a good husband and a father? That's it. End of story.
Well,
that's part of the iconoclasm I think you're talking about.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Whoso it be a man must also be a nonconformist. Ralph Waldo Emerson. And that self-reliance. I mean, other than the Bible, self-reliance is probably the second most important book in my personal and philosophical development. There are a lot of people in philosophy that critique it for being very simple and just a poetic and not really systematic, because in contemporary philosophy we're used to like very systematic accounts of things, weird jargon being used to describe theories that no one but a few people have heard. That's what people think philosophy is. No, but philosophy, in my opinion, is just, number one, it's wondering about the universe, and then it's not simply wondering. It's wondering about the universe and then trying to arrive at conclusions about different segments of reality, whether that be ethics relating to society, whether that be metaphysics relating to the world, whether that be, aesthetics relating to the value of beauty in the world and society, or what have you. And that's what real philosophy is to me. And, since you've opened up, I'll open up a little bit as well. One of the biggest problems that I faced, and I think many people in my generation face. I'm not sure if you know Dr. Gorka, but I'm only 21. But
I have to ask, because I do a lot of interviews every day, and usually they're a waste of oxygen because they're just boring. This is one of the best interviews ever. So what's your what? I mean, you're asking really good and incisive questions. So how do you know what you know?
a lot of reading, self-education, things of that sort. I have been following politics peripherally since 2011, since I was like very, very young. Obviously, I didn't know much. I was a little boy, but as I kept growing and learning, I began looking into more aspects of politics, and I took a more philosophical angle. And more recently, past few years, I've gotten into natural law theory, because I believe natural law theory is perhaps one of the most resoundingly powerful and just ethical theories. I would probably say it's probably one of the only just ethical theory out there. Maybe that's a little bit exclusive, but I think that it gets everything right. It gets the nature of the individual and value of the individual right. It gets the relation between man and society right. It gets everything right. Now, of course, I should probably specify, there's a lot of different natural law theories, right? There's Thomas natural law theory. There's also Enlightenment-based natural law theory. When I say natural law theory, I mean 17th century Enlightenment-based natural law theory. Think people like Locke, people like Hugo Grotius, things of that sort. And so my last dissertation was actually on Hugo Grotius as well, because I found it very interesting. He wrote the book on the rights of war and peace. I found it very interesting that he applies natural law to both international relations and then interpersonal activities as well. And so my interest in natural law has basically been a platform for me to try to analyze the ideas happening in society, happening in politics from a philosophical lens. And that's my cause célèbre, that's my mission, so to speak. And I'll open up, Dr. Gorka. I mean, one of my biggest issues that I've had is that, the comparison trap is so prevalent for, of course, folks in all age ranges, but especially for folks in my age range. Because you have mechanisms like Instagram and Twitter and the sort of prevalence of the digital influencer, where followers are where people seem to assign value to you as opposed to your ideas. And there have been a lot of times where I have found myself looking at my contemporaries and saying, well, you know a lot of stuff, you're around my age. I feel like I'm behind, or you have more followers than me. I feel like I'm behind. And that's a constant battle that one has
Yeah.
to have when they're in this kind of industry. So I don't know if you have any advice or any thoughts on that particularly.
Um, Look, just ask my wife. I spend I, how many hours a day on social media, and it's corrosive. And when I pick up, look, when I meet young people at the beginning of their career and they ask for advice, and whether they want to be national security experts, politicians, whether they want to be brain surgeons, I have the same piece of advice for all of them. Put the stinking phone down and read a book, preferably, let's go with Shakespeare, preferably a book that is more than 400 years old, and ideally a book that is at least 2,000 years old. If you spend an hour with Aristotle or with Shakespeare or with Locke or with Hume, it will be worth more than a year on social media. And I'm not joking, a year on social media. To be brutally honest with you, it's what, 2022? When I pick up a book and I try and read, within 2 minutes, I'm itching, right? And I lose concentration, and I want to think, hey, how many likes have I got on that really cool thing that I just posted? And I have to catch myself, and I'm a grown up. And look, there was, I remember when there were no phones. I remember when the first, mobile phones were created, and I was already a working man. So it's very simple. So let me react to something you said earlier. So my first degree was philosophy and theology. And I studied with the Jesuits, not the new Jesuits, not the scumbag Jesuits, but the old school Jesuits.
How was that, by the way? That's very like kind of like a hazing process, I'm guessing, given how intense it was, I'm sure.
It was painful. It was truly mentally painful. Not because of the hard, how much work it was, but because when you're reading Descartes with a Jesuit, when you're reading Plato with one of the greatest Jesuit philosophers in England, your brain hurts because you're asking really big questions. And you're lucky, I can't believe you're 21, but for me, for the first 30 years, it's a process of just asking questions. You're not going to be wise and sagacious,
Right.
In all likelihood, until you've asked enough of the questions. And for me, yes, it was mentally painful, but my gosh, I wouldn't sacrifice a second of it, because it got me to a point where I still ask those right questions. And don't get lost in the fanciness. The truth of the world is very simple. And this is where, as a former academic, as a former associate dean and a professor, it's very easy to get seduced by the sexy theories, by the latest permutations. I mean, for people who only know me from TV and from radio, they'll be shocked that one of the things I love to do the most is to sit down with the latest scientific journal on international relations theory or geostrategy, and then get lost down a rabbit warren reading one article that has 70 footnotes. And then I realize at the end of the day, really, sorry, the world isn't about artificial taxonomies of different schools of thought that I can impose upon them. It's about truth. Well, one of the most shocking things somebody told me, a very wise man told me, Robert Riley, who's written some incredible books on natural law, on music, on jihadi ideology, is, Seb, you have to understand the difference between us and them. Western civilization isn't an ideology. Everybody else has an ideology, whether it's Confucius, Taoist, Islamist, whether it's Marxist. Those are ideologies which provide a prism of distortion through which reality is perverted. Western civilization, the Judeo-Christian civilization, natural law isn't an ideology. It's not an interpretation of reality. It is the truth. And all we need to do is serve the truth. And after 2 years of COVID, this is the shocking reality that I, as an immigrant to America, find so depressing, but I'm still an optimist, is that we've lost that commitment to the truth. Nobody knew anything about COVID for 6 months, but anybody with access to the internet can find out sooner or later. You know what? That cloth mask doesn't even stop smoke particulates. So the idea that it's going to stop a virus that's at 1 nanometer, hang on, that's the denied science. The fact that 500 children have died of COVID in 2 years in a population of 320 million. Why are you, I walk past the playground every day walking my dogs, and I see parents putting masks on their 3-year-olds, and I'm going, are you in a cult? I mean, seriously. So
it's demented.
You talked about prudence. Prudence is the most important virtue for a statesman. The most important virtue for a man, which makes all the other virtues possible, is courage. And the idea that we're told to shut down every business, 44 million people actually lose their jobs, and then one restaurant owner in California says no, or one bar owner in New Jersey says no. Well, Christy, that should have been 100,000 businesses who said, screw you, Fauci, screw you.
Yes.
I get to feed my children, and guess what? My employees get to feed their children. Where is the courage of the pioneer spirit of the colonialists who said, the British Empire may be the most powerful empire the world has ever seen, but we're going to go up against them with Kentucky rifles? That's the American way. So at the end of the day, we're getting really into big stuff here, but it's about truth, and it's about courage to serve the truth, which of course is logos, is God. I mean, there is your obsession with natural law is absolutely justified, because there is no other philosophy, if you want to call it that, that is actually demonstrably objective. Every other philosophy, I can say, really, why can't I kill a lot of people? If it's utilitarian to kill a lot of people, well, there'll be more food left for the rest of us. So it's morally sound. There is no philosophy outside of natural law that I can't deconstruct instantly, because there's no anchor to objective truth.
Boom, absolutely. And that's why I like natural law so much, because again, the natural law theorists tend to put a lot of emphasis on observation, filtering observation through reason, and using what is reflected in reality as a basis for how we should conduct ourselves in society, to have morally responsible lives. And that's something that spoke to me when I first, I don't know how I've always had an inclination, because I fall into the labels. I try to avoid labels, because sometimes labels, they're good heuristics. They're very good heuristics, but heuristics are sometimes taken to be the whole of something, not just a start to get to something.
Very limiting. Labels are only good for 5% of the discussion.
Right. But I call myself, Dr. Gorka, a conservatarian, meaning that I believe that a lot of America's traditions are fundamentally good because they put emphasis on the value of the individual and on freedom. But I also emphasize liberty, so much in the school of the late, great Frank Meyer, who wrote for National Review. So that means I have a lot of positions that seem very libertarian, and some more that seem very culturally conservative. But I don't neatly fit into either box. I'm an eclectic blend of both. And so that means I have, and I think that a lot of mainstream conservative figures over the past few decades have been like this. I think Reagan was exactly like this. He said the heart and soul of conservatism is libertarianism. I think Bill Buckley later on in his life was definitely like this. And he's absolutely my intellectual inspiration, by the way. And so you have to you straddle the line sometimes, because people who are let's say more on the post-liberal right, who are skeptical of the Enlightenment, like people like Deneen and Vermeule, they may say, well, you're compromising our culture. How dare you do all that libertarian stuff? And people who are on the more libertarian right might say, well, hey, you're acting like an authoritarian because you don't want people to live how they want to live. So how dare you do that? And it's just, neither assertion is true. I want folks, there are many different ways of living, and we have to choose which way is best for ourselves and our families, so long as those ways are not injurious to the rights of another. Having said that, I do believe that I can have an opinion about a cultural topic or a social topic without my opinion being injurious to another, because again, that's just simply my opinion. Now, the problem is when people try to enact their opinions into law, that's the problem, and this is where we get back into that conversation about objective truth, objective morality.
I would just say one thing, and this is just being brutally honest. Conservatarian is not useful, because I don't think you're a libertarian, and I think this has something to do with the way libertarianism has evolved in the last 30 years. Libertarianism is basically a sham version of anarchy. It is anarchy under a faux conservative label, because if you push them hard enough, whether it's drugs or whether it's anything else, there's no moral compass, there's no anchor, there's no guide star for the moral content. And what you're talking about, I think what you really are, is a classical liberal, because what the founding fathers were clear upon is that you don't have to be a Christian or a Jew to live in America. You don't have to be a practicing Judeo-Christian, but the society, whether you like it or not, is informed by 4,000-5,000 years of Judeo-Christian values. That's Western civilization. So you clearly have a moral compass, and libertarianism today doesn't. It's like, do whatever you want as long as you're not, hurting me. Well, that's a childish. Libertarianism is philosophy for 12-year-olds. It's not thought out. And I think you're a Mill, you're a Burke, you're a classic liberal. The trouble is we have to recapture the word liberal from the crazy progressives.
Yeah, well, Dr. Gorka, and I think this might be an issue we might disagree on, because I don't think libertarianism as a whole is just a sort of, as you would say it, a poorly put together philosophical justification for hedonism. I think that it's what's that
become that.
It has become. I agree. There are a lot of people who use libertarianism to justify their hedonism, and that's not good. But if you look back in the 40s or in the 50s and 60s, even someone like Murray Rothbard, who was an avowed anarchist, who I don't agree with whatsoever, he was talking about natural law, natural rights. He was talking about the need for a culturally conservative society. He was allying with people like Pat Buchanan and folks like that. Not saying I approve of any of that. All I'm saying is he was probably one of the most libertarian of the libertarians, and yet he had this idea of creating a voluntary society constituted upon conservative values. I think it's possible. I have an aversion to coercion, Dr. Gorka, in most cases. I think coercion force has its place, but when you coerce people into doing something that is against their conscience, that's when I have a problem. And by conscience,
for example, who's that guy, Michael, what's his face,
Michael Malice? Okay, yeah, I don't like Michael Malice. I think he's
He says, what about rapes? Well, we'd have a lot of rapes and robbery, but it wouldn't be too bad. I mean, that's another childish way of thinking.
I agree.
But I believe this is the compromise has to be made. So in terms of compulsion, if you believe in the nation state, if you believe that the Westphalian model, if we don't want to live in tribes and clans, the most sustainable form for human civilization is the Westphalian nation state. Well, guess what? The nation state has a certain unique monopoly on the use of force, but it has to be constrained by the will of the people that are represented in the organs of power. So there's got to be some compulsion, but it's got to be limited as much as possible, because otherwise you go back to a pre-Westphalian tribal society.
Right. So I'm what you would call a classical liberal, like a 1940s libertarian, an old right libertarian, in the tradition of Albert J. Nock and those people who wanted to have a more conservative culture, but wanted to limit the boundaries of force and compulsion as much as possible to a strict set of terms. Robert Nozick, people like that. That's the tradition I'm part of. The Michael Malices of the world and the people who don't give any serious consideration to philosophical thought and just say, you just do whatever you want to, and we'll just have this voluntary society. Those people are philosophically infantile. I'm not trying
Yes.
to call out anyone, but Michael Malice especially is philosophically infantile. What's that?
They're talking about systems that are that not even, it's not that they aren't sustainable, they can't even be established.
Right. Oh, yes. I look, and this is one of the things, and we'll close because I know we've gone over time. I know we've gone over time, and I appreciate you being here so much. And I hope you come back for a longer conversation because we have
Sure.
to have. But the thing about anarchy is anarcho-capitalism, particularly. I think that's the variant that Malice doesn't explicitly subscribe to, but that's what he's more closer to from what I've gathered. I think the problem with anarchy is that it presumes that everyone is operating on the same set of values.
Yes.
Now, look, I agree with anarchists who invoke natural law and say, hey, this is what objective reality says. This is what the correct human values are. But I also recognize the allegory of the cave. And I understand that a lot of people don't see the light, they see the shadows. And they are bound by the shadows. And so long as they are bound by the shadows, we have to have some mechanism capable of protecting the light from their grubby hands. And anarcho-capitalism does not.
That not only do they only see the shadow, those who subscribe to that philosophy miss the biggest part of why a system has to function in a certain way, which is that we are fallen. If you don't believe that man is fallen, then you don't understand what anarchy will actually lead to.
Right. No, I entirely agree. Not everyone has the same set of terms. And there are some people who reject your set of terms and would love to force their set of terms on you by force. And at some point, paying for a police force or all this stuff that the anarchists propose, the various different proposals they propose to protect a free society, is not going to protect a free society. It's not going to be a free society anymore. So, I get into fights all the time with anarchists about this. And look, I have many friends who are anarchists. I love them to death on many issues. I love them to death, Dr. Gorka. I think that they have a lot of the correct morals, but they don't recognize the need for a stabilizing force in society, the monopoly on force, the government, to ensure.
At the end of the day, use the word infantile. It is a childish way of looking at the human condition.
I
truly
agree.
is.
I agree. All right. Dr. Gorka, thank you so much, sir.
One suggestion for you, some homework. I don't know if you do it already, but you need to write and you need to publish.
Yes, I do, sir. But I want to do it more widely. Absolutely. In addition to the YouTube channel, I also do that as well. Yeah. But thank you, Dr. Gorka. I really appreciate your time. And for everyone else who's watched this, thank you so much for watching. And please stay pensive. Bye-bye, guys.